Well, our first scripture reading is not our normal scripture reading for Easter Sunday. It is our normal scripture reading for Christmas Eve. So it should sound very familiar to you. John chapter 1, verses 1 through 5. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. Our gospel reading today is one of your more traditional Easter readings. It's from the Gospel of Mark, and just a word before I read this. In the very earliest manuscripts that we have of Mark, the gospel ends right where our reading is going to end today. And you will notice that it's kind of an odd ending for a book about good news. In fact, we think that some of the scribes, as they started copying this book through the years, were so uncomfortable with how this ended that they wrote their own endings. And you'll see that in your own Bibles. If you open up to the end of the Gospel of Mark, you will see after verse 8, where I'm going to stop, it says the shorter ending of Mark, and then there's the longer ending of Mark. So you have your choice about how you want to end this gospel as you read. I'm going to end with the original ending, at least as far as we have record of it. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James and Salome brought spices so that they might go and anoint Jesus. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. They'd been saying to one another, "Who will roll the stone away for us from the entrance to the tomb?" When they looked up, they saw that the stone had already been rolled away. It was very large. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe, sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed, for you are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, there is the place they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. There is definitely an unsettled feeling to Easter this year. We're not gathered in our churches to worship. I'm looking around our sanctuary, and I only need one hand to count the people who are sitting out in the pews right now to put this service together for us. We are not gathering with our families for a big Easter dinner like a lot of us are used to, or maybe some of us are, but keep under that magic number of 10. But even then, I know a lot of families are just choosing not to do that this year and not have those family gatherings. There's certainly no traveling across state to visit relatives, and that's because if you do, you got to self-quarantine for 2 weeks once you get back. It's definitely a different Easter this year than what we've ever experienced before. In many ways, this is not Easter today. We are still living in Saturday. Think about what Saturday is this week. Saturday is that day between Friday when Jesus died and Sunday when Jesus rose. It was that time when we aren't sure what the next day is going to bring. We aren't sure when life is going to get back to normal, whatever normal happens to mean for each of us. We aren't sure when the limits on social gatherings are going to be eliminated, so we're not sure when we're going to be able to congregate again as a congregation, much less as groups of friends out and about. We aren't sure when it's going to be safe to travel again. And when things do get back to normal, we aren't sure what that normal is going to be. We don't know what it's going to look like. We don't know what will have changed in our habits and our patterns and our rules for how we do things once everything is, for lack of another word, I guess, back to normal. And that is kind of the story of Easter. It's between Good Friday when Jesus died and Easter Sunday when Jesus rose from the dead. His disciples had no clue Easter was going to come the next day. They didn't know what tomorrow would bring. And let's be honest about that. We'd like to be able to say, well, Jesus told them several times that he would have to suffer, he would die, and then after 3 days, he would rise again from the dead. Well, let me just ask you, if a good friend of yours told you that story, would you believe them? Maybe you would just humor them. I would not believe them. I think the disciples were as unprepared for Easter as anybody was. They were also afraid. They were followers of a man who'd been convicted of treason, who had been executed by the state with the full support and encouragement of the religious authorities. You can bet that as followers of that condemned criminal, some of them had to have been wondering when their time would be up. They were afraid. They were also experiencing a great loss, a friend, a teacher, a mentor, the loss of a dream. They had hoped Jesus would be the one who would change the world for them, usher in a new reality, one where they were no longer on the bottom of the pyramid, usher in a new reality where fear and anxiety about the future was something they would never have to have again. They had hoped that Jesus would usher in a new reality where their burdens would be lifted from them and their worries. But Jesus was gone now. It's Saturday, and they saw him die, and they saw him put in the tomb, and they saw the stone rolled in front of it. Saturday was about as dark as it could get, and they did not know what Sunday would bring. You see, they didn't know if their lives would go back to the way they were. They didn't know if they would go back to their old jobs. They probably suspected they would, and if you read the Gospel of John, some of them actually did go back to their old jobs before they realized Jesus was alive and everything was different. They probably wondered what things were going to look like in the future. They were in a pretty precarious position being, again, followers of someone who is condemned for treason. Would their lives be different? Would their circumstances be different? They didn't know what Sunday would bring. But I can guarantee you one thing. They did not expect Jesus to show up. They did not expect Jesus to rise from the dead. We know the women didn't expect that. Here they are. They've come to the tomb with their spices that were required by the Jewish tradition to anoint the bodies of the dead. They didn't have time to do that on the night that Jesus died, so they showed up Sunday morning to do it. They were very much aware of the situation there, that Jesus was in a tomb with an incredibly heavy stone in front of it. They were wondering who would roll that stone away. They didn't have the capability to do that. But you know, when they got to the tomb, the stone had already been rolled away. The tomb was open, and Jesus was not there. I can guarantee you they didn't think he rose from the dead. They probably were just starting to wonder if someone had stolen the body. And about that time, a young man who's actually in the tomb speaks to them and tells them, Jesus is alive. And guess what? He has gone ahead of you to Galilee. Go tell his disciples. Good news, right? Well, how does the gospel end? It ends with the women running away in fear and not telling anyone. They had good reason to be afraid. If what that young man told them was true, then the chains of death had been broken. And if the chains of death had been broken, what was about to be let loose in the world? There was a power in Jesus that was completely unimaginable to them. The gospel ends with an overwhelming sense of fear. The world, as they knew it, if they believed this young man, the world as they knew it had been turned upside down. and they didn't know what to make of it. But here's the other thing. The gospel doesn't actually end right there. I'm not talking about the other editorial endings that were added at some later date. Even without those, the gospel does not end in fear in the cemetery. And we know that because we are here. A few of us sitting in the sanctuary, you of you sitting on your couches at home. They told somebody, or we would not be here today. Somehow those women found a faith and a courage and a hope that outweighed their fear. Somehow, in the darkness of their grief and their fear, light dawned. The promise of Easter is not that the whole world will be magically changed overnight. It's not the promise that we will wake up and all of a sudden everybody will be well, that there will be no more illness in the world, or no death, no loneliness, no injustice, no war, no isms or phobias. The promise of Easter is not that all of that will be magically gone. The promise of Easter is that there's a light shining in the darkness, and the darkness cannot overcome it. The darkness will not overcome it. The darkness will never be able to overcome it. That's the promise of Easter. And if you doubt that, think about this. Jesus' resurrection happened in the dark. We are told from all the Gospels that the women came to the tomb when it was early morning. Some of them actually say just before dawn. And by the time they got to the tomb, Jesus was already alive. The stone had already been moved away. Jesus was already on the move. Easter began sometime in the night when it was still dark. Christ breaks those chains of death, not when the sun rose, to reveal a brand new transformed world, but in the dark of night when fear and anxiety and uncertainty are at their highest. What makes Easter so powerful is that we can now understand Saturday better. Not necessarily the Saturday before Jesus rose, but all of our Saturdays from here on out. That Saturday that can come at any time, any day of the week, between a death and an unknown future. That's Saturday. It's like that Saturday we are living in right now. As some taste the anxiety of not knowing if they'll have a job on the other side of the pandemic. We taste the fear that goes along with watching the counts of cases and deaths rise from COVID-19. We worry about whether we will get sick and carry that disease to someone else. We wrestle with the uncertainty of not knowing how things will be different, or how long it will be before things are back to normal, or even what normal will look like. I can only imagine the loneliness of those who are dying alone in hospitals right now, and the grief of their families that are not able to be with them as they die. Saturday is dark. But Saturday is not the last word. Because Easter struck a light in the darkness, and the darkness cannot put it out. What those women at the tomb experienced after their initial fright, of course, was a light in their darkness. A darkness that seemed as black could be, but all of a sudden Christ is alive. And it's like someone struck a match and lit up the whole place. Death's power is not eternal. And they knew then that the one who loved them, the one who saw them, the one who gave them purpose, the one who showed them the heart of God, he was alive. He broke those chains of death, and he was alive. They took that Easter light and they ran with it. They shared it with the disciples. They shined it into their darkness. They shined it into the darkness of the world, and truly nothing has been the same since then. Because when the chains of death are broken, for those who believe, night becomes as day, and there's no need to be afraid, because we are not alone. We are not victims of the dark. Christ is alive. Friends, on this strange and unusual Sunday, know that the light of Christ cannot be extinguished by a virus. Know that no matter what darkness you are in, you are not alone. Look to the light of Easter. Come, join that small group of women and hear that good news that Christ is alive. Know that whatever your fears, they pale in comparison to Christ's love for you and Christ's willingness to fight death for you. And know that whatever you are anxious about, tomorrow, Christ will still be alive. Don't keep this good news to yourself. Share it. Take that light and shine it into somebody else's darkness so they can know what you know.